All right. I think we're good there.
All right, welcome everybody to the Dad's Doomsday Guide. Today we're talking about the Jinn hauntings, what they're responsible for. I've gotten a lot of comments recently on, and for you to know Pablo, and we're joined by Pablo. And you're active more on TikTok, correct? Before we get into the actual episode.
Yes, that's correct. I do most of my streaming and, just research on TikTok these days.
And what's your I guess what's your focus on TikTok?
I'm in a lot of collectibles communities.
Mm-hmm.
We were talking the other day, collect die-cast cars, but I also have a lot of an affinity for what we call the paranormal here,
Mm-hmm.
things that operate outside of conventional academia and religion. And those topics have always been of interest to me, having
Yeah.
growing up in a religious household. I've had exposure to these uh, ideologies as a child, and then as you grow up, you become a little cynical, a little jaded, but in the end, there's always a connection back to those roots, right?
Yeah, and kind of going with that, and what I was beginning to say is that we have gotten a lot of comments about Jinn, and I've noticed that before. It's like a very popular subject when we talk about demonic possession or hauntings or anything else. That always comes up, and I personally never really knew much about them, and I don't know if you had any background or knowledge of them, but I do have like a few things because I was doing a little bit of research last night, and we will have someone on who's like kind of more of an expert in this area. But for you, had you heard of them before in paranormal circles, or when you do research, would that pop up, or is this something to kind of, I guess, you would get it in passing, but you never would go down the rabbit hole?
No, I did go down the rabbit hole quite a few years ago, studying, ancient Mesopotamian religions, from the Sumerians. I guess here we associate jinn with a lot of Arabic myths,
Hmm.
but if you think about the root word for jinn, it's jinnin, which literally means to conceal or to hide. And I guess loosely in the Western culture, we try to associate jinn with demons and angels, but the origin of these beings is a little bit more detailed than that. It's not just good and evil. I
Hmm.
believe jinn can be good or bad, and we have a lot of manifestations, a lot of people that have interacted with them. So
Hmm.
it's always been of interest to me.
Yeah, it was interesting because I was looking at it, and I have like I took down a couple notes, but so they were created before humans in like the timeline, and
Hmm.
this is a non-expert opinion, so I'm open to people correcting me if I'm wrong. Um, but so it goes that man was made by clay, angels were made by light, and then the jinn were made of smokeless fire. And that was one of the things that started I guess, not a debate people were having on one of the little teasers I did, where a gentleman named of Anthony Peak, who came on the podcast, and he had a whole like framework of consciousness and what we're doing here and like life in general. But he mentioned that a lot of the paranormal does seem to correlate, and people think it's jinn, and the smokeless fire being what today we would know as plasma. And that was one of the things that people would say, because in paranormal events, he had a priest tell him, an exorcist, is that they were getting stuff coming through as plasma. That's how it would manifest into our world, and then it would use that to come in and out. And their thinking was, and it was kind of odd, like some of the things that were lining up with this, I guess, lore of the jinn was lining up with current day UFO stuff. But have you looked at the whole plasma smokeless fire connection? Did you come across that at all?
Yeah, exactly. If you look at some of these things that are coming to light now that Congress is slowly leaking out, like those plasma orbs that have been captured, with high definition cameras. There's one, as a matter of fact, that was, videotaped. Was it Iraq? And they saw this thing just flying by. Cameras captured it, but the locals, they were not really impressed because they said, "Hey, this is something that we see every day here. This is nothing new to us."
Hmm.
They sort of grew up knowing about these things and being part of their culture. uh, so yes, even from a Western religious background, if you take a look at the Bible, there's reference to these beings, and what they were describing at that time, the authors of these ancient books, they were trying to describe as best they could according to what they knew. And now that we have the advent of high definition cameras and they're rolling all the time, we're starting to see that a lot of these things more or less align with the, I guess, primitive descriptions of these orbs and these spinning wheels and these light beams. We're
Hmm.
starting to see them manifest. And, it just, to me, it reinforces the fact that these things exist and they've always been there.
Yeah, and that was one of the things. Is one of the other things was they could view us, but we can't view them, and that was really weird and interesting. And apparently, like you said, the Jinn can be good and bad. They aren't necessarily like a demon, because I always equated it to like kind of like a demon when I first heard it. But um, demons don't really come up. And Satan was just, I guess, a Jinn who was bad. Um, and the evil ones are part of the test for humans. And I thought that was interesting. And what was weird is because they're in the parallel world and they can see us. Is a part of it was part of it was is that they could take humans sometimes and take them back to that Jinn world. And it
Hmm.
sounded a lot like alien abduction. I was kind of like, this is very strange. So like I could see why it hit multiple points about how people were correlating it to with UFOs. And you tie in like Jacques Vallée, who talks about them being interdimensional and not extraterrestrial. And so that made a lot of sense to me, whether or not you want to prescribe the label of Jinn to them or not, that they would kind of held on to these attributes. And it makes you wonder, like people who wrote this stuff back in the day, um, if they were experiencing these things that we look at as UFOs, and that's kind of like some of the attributes they give to them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's interesting to note that when you're talking about these things being able to possess, right? Possess, physical bodies. The Arabic word for madman is majun, which literally translates to jinn possessed. So they believe that these things interact with us, whether they're interdimensional or from another realm. But they do believe that we can cross over both them into our world, and if you really go looking for it, if you're really seeking to become enlightened or to get in touch with them, you can open some sort of portal and access them. So, like you said, these things cohabitate with us. We don't necessarily see them. I think a lot of it has to do with just in modern culture, right? We try to, go by what we were taught in school, academia,
Hmm.
sort of like governs, our set of ideas. And we think, oh, that's not rational. That seems irrational. But people in ancient times didn't really have to struggle so much with that. They just
Hmm.
accepted things for what they are, much like, go ahead.
No, I was going to say you're so right, because I was talking to a few people, several people on the podcast now, who a lot of people concentrate on the consciousness studies and they're trying to find out what exactly is is reality. Like it's not what you see, right? It's not the evolutionary processes we went through to stay alive.
Yeah,
Those are a survival mechanism for the world we're in. And whether you want to use terminology like simulation theory, you want to use consciousness as like the base layer of reality, and we're in a dream. Whatever kind of you put on that vocabulary wise, I feel like it's talking about a lot of the same things. Um, and there's this tendency that we look at like past civilizations, and if they're not, because they didn't have the scientific method or whatever else, and so we disparage them and think, oh, these beliefs or these experiences aren't valid because they were just looking at thunder and getting scared of the gods. We it's to me it's crazy. I don't know if
right.
it drives me nuts, because I talk to these people and they're trying to like say, like, hey, there's evidence for this stuff. Like you can't necessarily duplicate it in a lab, and it's hard to kind of isolate, but there's something to it, right? When you parse through kind of all the charlatans and the people scamming people and like maybe people who have a mental illness, once you get down to like the core experiences, you can't, and I've always had this opinion, like you can't just brush it off and call it all crazy. I don't know if you had an opinion on that, but it drives me nuts.
Yeah, and it's always baffled me how people can, again, having grown up in a religious household, we quickly accept, what's written in the Bible as, fact. It's not just a book based on people's opinions. We take that by faith to be fact. Then if we're so if we so easily accept those things as facts, why can't we accept other narratives as facts as well, other people's cultures and written accounts of these things as just taking them at face value without trying to put them through the filter of, oh, does it align with my beliefs? I believe that good and evil have always been present. It's been the ongoing struggle of humanity, right? And of course, in different areas of the world, or different geographic regions, they're going to be called by different names, just based
Hmm.
on language, right?
Hmm.
So these things, in my opinion, they're there. They're validated by not only the Bible, but by other ancient, scriptures as well. And no matter if you're here in the Americas or you're in Africa or you're in Asia, if you look at their history and culture, there's always stories about beings that interact with us that are not human, and they weren't necessarily talking about extraterrestrials coming from above. They're talking about other entities, that have always existed amongst us, right?
Hmm.
And I just think in today's world, we're just so consumed and so distracted by technology. It's sort of, you have to do like a digital detox, like go off into the mountains or go camping sometime and just disconnect from everything to
Hmm.
once again come into tune with these things, and be more acceptable to just accepting them for what they are.
Hmm. Yeah, and I was listening to a couple people talking about the psi abilities, and people can get in touch like mediumship and things. And I've always been hesitant. I think we probably have touched on this in the past, is like when you talk about like psychedelics and stuff, and people are talking about your ability to get in touch with that realm, whatever that realm is. And I personally am afraid to do that because one, if I do like some kind of psychedelic, like I'm scared what's going to bubble up. Like what am I what am I going to find out about myself that I've kind of hidden? And then the the other part is uh what door do you open? Because I heard this guy talking on an interview, and he's basically like, he did DMT, and then he like went on this trip or whatever, and then he was done and he came back, and he said he kept having weird experiences. Like there was, and he described it, and I can't really remember what it was. It was like he was still kind of one foot in that world. And so he did it again later, and then he said when he was done, he felt um the door shut to that world. And he said it, and then he was like, "Oh crap, it was open the whole time." And so that's what I'm concerned about, is when you go down that road, if you're doing mediumship or meditation, because I knew another guy who did meditation. He was starting to hear a voice kind of telling him what to do. And some people might be like, that's higher consciousness telling you. But these people talk about their lives getting better, and like, oh, and like getting like the download of information. But at the same
Mhm.
time, I'm worried about what you're letting in exactly. Like what exactly is telling you this information? I don't know if you
Yeah.
have.
No, no, yeah, and that's the one thing too, right? The one thing that keeps me from really diving headfirst into this type of research, it's
Yeah.
because I do believe that once you open that door, be careful what you go looking for because you just might find it, right? And then once you open up those portals, it's going to be difficult to just close them off, right?
Yeah.
And but there, like you said, there are people that are you know, written about these things, that they've been interacting with these beings and they feel like they've even been inspired to do great things. Uh, in Arabic culture, they believe that all the ancient poets were inspired directly by jinn. Again, they don't see them as necessarily demonic or being evil. They believe there's good jinn, that are here to benefit the people that they choose to interact with. And then, of course, there's the bad, mischievous ones, right, that are
Mhm.
here to deceive. Uh, and even today, a lot of musical artists, a lot of people in Hollywood, if you read their biographies, they'll always reference back to an encounter that they had with something, right? And that
Mhm.
inspired them to go out and do these great things and tell these stories and write these songs. And there's some truth to that. I think there's something there. If so many different people are claiming the same type of experiences, something they must hold some validity.
Yeah. Have you ever had an experience, any kind of paranormal or any strange experience?
Well, yes. As a youth, when I was 16 and 17, I worked at a summer camp, and it was funny. It's not that far from Los Angeles. It's out in the Santa Monica Mountains, but it's about 2 miles from any major road. Deep down in the mountains at night, it just becomes totally pitch black dark, and the only way you can move around is by the moonlight if it's a full moon or with a flashlight. And I do recall on one occasion walking to my cabin by myself around 9:30 at night and just becoming paralyzed with fear. I didn't understand why suddenly I couldn't move my legs, and I wanted to yell, and my voice would just it wasn't coming out. And then I just noticed everything seemed to stand still, and I heard a rustling above me in the tree branches, and I looked up and I couldn't see anything. I can't say that I saw anything, but I felt something. It was sort of like that eerie feeling that you're being watched, right?
Uh,
And again, growing up religious, I just invoked the name of Jesus and I said, God, please help me. I don't know what's going on, but in your name, I rebuke whatever might be out there. And I felt my legs and I took off running. But when I got to my cabin that night, I locked it up. And, this was before everybody had cell phones and pagers. So I was just by myself. I knew I was going to have to spend that night by myself in that cabin until daylight. And, I don't know how I fell asleep. What I do remember is that I would take a little radio with me back in those days, a little plug-in radio with a CD player, and
mhm.
I had it on a timer, and that would be my alarm that would wake me up at 6 o'clock in the morning. I woke up that morning, it was 7 o'clock, and I wondered why did my alarm not go off?
Oh, weird.
And then I tried turning on my radio, and it wouldn't turn on. And somehow, some way, it had been unplugged from the wall.
Oh, weird.
Uh, so yeah, so I had fallen asleep on sleep timer and expecting to wake up with the alarm on the little radio. And at some point during the night, it became detached from the wall, the plug, and that always stuck with me. The thing that happened that night with whatever was up there in the trees that scared me, and the fact that somehow, some way, my radio became detached from the wall outlet, and it just, you know, it did something to me. It made me respect these things a lot more. I
Hmm.
was a fan of scary movies and things like that. For a while there, I took a break from any type of scary movies or literature, and it gives you a sense of respect for that. But again, curiosity kills the cat, right? So
Did you
now, as
ever
an
did you ever
Mhm.
mess with or play with like Ouija boards, things like that? That everybody looks at today. Did you ever come across that when you in your youth?
No, I never dabbled in that. I was always really scared to open that door. I knew better than to go testing those waters, if you will.
We did it. Well, as like a kid, you kind of mess around with like at a sleepover. I think we did it once and nothing happened, so we got bored. But recently, when we first started the podcast, we went to a medium, a psychic medium, and she was very kind because she was like one of the first people that actually would come on as a guest when you're virtually unknown, and most people said no. And we ended up going there, and she had what would be like a Ouija board, but it was a planchette and it was a piece of chalk, and the piece of chalk was on like a chalkboard, and it was like me, my brother, and then maybe a friend or two. So everybody that was touching the piece of the planchette, I knew. And they put it on there and nothing's really happening. And all of a sudden it starts to move. And you're just like, you're resting on it. You're not doing
Wow.
much. And then it starts to make like circles and it starts going faster and faster and faster. And we actually have it on video. And that thing at one point
No
is
way.
spinning so fast. It's doing like aggressive circles, like a vortex. And
Right.
you could almost let go for a second and it would keep going and then it would slowly stop. And we were checking under the table. We were flipping the thing upside down. We're like, dude, she's tricking us because like I knew everybody. Like, you're not doing it right. No one was doing it. We're all laughing because it was so strange.
Yeah.
And I know there's like a psychological component where they try to say there's something that you're I don't know, like a subconscious thing where you're moving even though you don't think you're moving. And I find that so hard to believe because that's kind of one of the few things physically that I saw or witnessed or felt or was part of that when it was moving, like it was moving. And I, I was like, after that, I was like, I'm not gonna mess with this, because it was too weird. And
Yeah.
like to this day, I don't know. I know she was. I'm fairly sure she wasn't tricking us because it was just too incredible. But I don't know. It would have to be something that just like a subconscious thing, or it's something was moving it. 'Cause, like, it would only happen if you relaxed. You had to really relax, and then I was, like,
Yeah.
playing playing games in my head. I'm like, "Am I letting something in through me?" And it's, like, moving the thing because that's the idea. It's going through you and moving it. So I was like,
Right.
I don't know." So
You're a
I
conduit for it. Is that the idea,
exactly,
that you become a conduit for this to be able to interact with our physical realm?
exactly.
Okay.
And I don't know if that's smart, even if you feel like I don't know. There's, like, 2 sections. I don't know if you follow parapsychologists at all or psychic research. Like these guys will go in there and they approach it more from a non-religious point of view. And it's interesting because they'll try to run studies and they'll focus on mediums and psychics. And I don't get the sense they're as concerned about they think there is, I think, probably darker stuff, but they don't get the same sense of like don't mess with it, right? Where from a religious perspective, you were like, don't mess with it because you don't know what you're opening
Hmm.
the door to. How do you
Hmm.
personally feel about it? I mean, do you because I know you have an interest for trying to figure out what is the truth, right? We're all kind of after like what's
Hmm.
the truth? Like what happens after you die, or is there these things that exist? Coupled with you don't want to expose yourself and put yourself at risk.
Right.
I mean, and then the other in the back of your head is probably like, is this even really real? You know what I mean? Like there's weird game that plays for me. But
Yeah.
how do you fall on it? And do you ever think like, oh, it'd be cool to like experience this or dabble in it or try to see if there's something there?
Yeah, I think for me it's not so much a fear, it's more of a respect for it.
Mm,
And again, maybe I'm a bit influenced by and biased by my religious upbringing, but because even in the Bible it talks about, soothsayers and
mm-hmm,
mediums that existed during those times, and they sort of didn't really get along, or they didn't coexist in a normal way with, when Jesus came and his disciples started preaching the gospel. They sort of like rebuked these things, right? But clearly they existed even before the gospel, right? So these things have always been there, and so I try to reconcile that, right, with my respect for that and trying to be not that I follow all the scriptures, but for some reason, that part of it, it's always scared me, right, to dabble in it. At the same time, I do want to know what else is out there, and so there is something that calls me to do more research and to maybe find somebody who's more in tune with that and to show me how I too may be able to experience some of that. But just by the one experience that I told you about, I think that was enough for me to validate the fact that there's more out there, things that we don't necessarily see with our eyes, but we can definitely be perceptive towards them, right?
Hmm.
Um, I don't know if you've ever gone to a house or a building that you've entered and you've just felt some sort of ominous presence there. I feel that. I've been to places. I remember when we were house hunting, there were a couple of properties that we went to view with the realtor, and as soon as we stepped in through that door, there was just such a heavy presence there. And it's hard to explain because you can't say, "Oh, I saw this" or "I saw that," but you definitely feel something. And
Hmm.
there's places like that. I think there's just like a certain energy that lingers in certain areas and hovers and dwells there. And if you go disturb it, that's where you get these hostile interactions, I believe, like all the hauntings that I'm sure we're all familiar with, right? That have been popularized by Hollywood and movies. You get the classic scene where somebody moves into a new home and suddenly they start having these experiences, because they can't coexist with whatever energy dwells there. And I
Hmm.
think the same can be said for many places. Like you hear about like ancient or sacred grounds, right? Where Native Americans, buried their dead and they conducted certain rituals. Now these places we've taken over them, we've civilized and build communities there. And sometimes people have these experiences at these places. And you wonder why, right? And you start doing the research, and you come to find out that was not necessarily a burial ground, but a ceremonial site, right? A sacred land to certain people, and there must be a reason for that. And
Hmm.
maybe, and whoever goes to live there doesn't do it on purpose. They're not trying to disturb these entities, but they don't know any better. They just happen to be there, and that just so happens to be a place where something already dwells, and that's where you get these hostile interactions.
Hmm.
So for me, like I'd say I'm interested in doing it, but I want to know more about what I'm getting myself really into, because again, my bias is that, that's sort of like on the darker side, right, of interactions. And
Hmm.
so I really want to go there.
Yeah, I had there's one experience. Well, actually, the same realtor. You would go there, and I think from the Asian term would be feng shui. I think it is when you go into a home and it feels
Right.
off and wrong. And there was a couple that we went into. One was really bizarre, but yeah, it has a bad energy. When I was a kid, my parents thought of moving, went to a house, and that was also strange. The kids, but that one was weird, more strange because the woman who lived there said she had paranormal stuff. She said that her husband, who was deceased, had held her down in the bed and choked her once. She was being very forthcoming. I don't know why, because like it made us all not want to move in there. And her kids were like turned out to be schizophrenic. And I remember me
Wow.
and my brother got in a really horrible fight, like a physical fight in the front of the yard when my parents were inside talking. But the whole energy around the place felt so dark. It was so strange. And that's the worst it's been in my entire life in terms of like a location. Um, so I agree, and that's why again the psychedelic use is like I'm kind of afraid to do it. And then, but I also know meditation. People can do meditations and get into a really deep
Hmm.
place. And I had that friend I talked about earlier who had done it and started hearing a voice telling him what to do, kind of like a guiding voice. He was telling me he felt that when you get to that place, it borders very closely to like schizophrenia. And I was kind of like, well, I don't really don't want to open that door either. And I think it's because there's this one psychiatrist, and she was on recently a couple podcasts, and she had her husband had died. She went down the rabbit hole because she wanted to contact him to see if anything was there. She ended up saying that stuff that she would prescribe medications for her patients, thinking they were mentally ill, she was starting to experience as she was going down the mediumship and like trying to contact him. And so now she doesn't feel as strongly that those things are medically they're wrong. It's such a gray line, right? Because you get into mental illness and you get into like hauntings and like are people really experiencing it? Or are they having some kind of mental break? So that's like you, I have like there's a respect for it, and I think it's there. But at the same time, we spend so much time talking about it on the podcast, and it's like you ever gonna like put your feet to the fire, like see what I mean?
Right.
But
Do you just want to watch from the sidelines, or do you want to
yeah,
actually get into the game, right?
yeah, and I've heard that before, and I think that people like will say or kind of criticize consciousness surviving death, but then when you ask them, have you ever had like, well, obviously most of them haven't had a near death experience, but have you ever done like a psychedelic experience? And they'll say no. And then it's like, well, how are you talking? You know what I mean? Because people who do that tend to have a different, not all, I'm sure, but tend to have a different viewpoint of what comes after. Um, but I don't know. You want, you have families, you want to be around for your kids. I don't think necessarily you want to like mentally fry yourself and come back. You're a Zen
Yeah.
Buddha master or something. You just don't want anything to do with your family. So, all those are worries, maybe when we're 60.
Yeah, definitely. I think also everybody's pre-wired differently, right? Everybody's programmed already as soon as you enter this world, you have a predisposition to do one thing or another. And like you said, to some people, it can result in like these schizophrenic episodes, and you hear that a lot actually. Sometimes the mainstream news doesn't necessarily elaborate on that, but a lot of these people that do these heinous things, right? Like, mass murderers and people like that, do unspeakable acts to other human beings, they claim to have been influenced by something. Oh, they heard a voice that
Hmm.
compelled them to do this or to do that. We just saw that horrible incident. What was in Tennessee on was it the subway or the bus, or that guy just took out that girl,
Oh,
and he
yeah,
claims
horrific.
that, yeah, that he heard and he was possessed. And of course, that's where you get into this whole argument or the debate over mental illness. Is it legit, or is it just a cop out that people say after the fact, to sort of justify what they did, or is this real? Do some people just completely become possessed by this negative energy, and then their body, like, again, it becomes a conduit to manifest these horrible things upon humanity.
Hmm.
And then you come to think about certain cultures, right? They think that by committing certain acts, they will be rewarded, in the afterlife. Again, it sort of goes hand in hand with that, right? Like, who are you listening to? Who's telling you to do these things? Who's telling you that, there's going to be a reward? Or in our culture, like if you do something, there's going to be a consequence, right? A negative consequence
Hmm.
for that.
Hmm.
So all these things either keep us in line or they compel us to do one thing.
Hmm.
There has to be, I'd like to think that there's a fine line, that you can sort of straddle, that have 1 foot in and 1 foot out, and just get
Yeah.
enough of a taste of it and then be able to pull yourself back out if it
Yeah.
becomes too much. But
Yeah.
that's the respect that I have for it. I think if you really go searching, you will find what you're looking for. It may not necessarily be a pleasant experience. Um,
Yeah.
so
Well,
that's what's kept me at bay.
interesting you said that though, because I think I read, and people can correct me if I'm wrong after the fact, is that they thought Jinn may be responsible for some mental illness issues. And that gets in a really sticky situation because we've talked to exorcists before and they go in there and really check people for psychological issues before they'll go down the road because, someone might sue, there's lawsuits. I mean, all that stuff is very high profile, especially when you get something like the Catholic Church involved in some kind of like deliverance. Um, but I don't, it would make sense if someone was struggling with that kind of stuff, if there were a spiritual component that it would latch on or would attack someone like that, because talk about torment, like how you already think someone's not gonna seeing things clearly, and then if they say, "Oh, I'm possessed by a demon," it's like, no, you're not. And I've heard another exorcist say, who we had on the show, Monsignor Stephen Rossetti, I think he was on another podcast, and he mentioned that he felt that they would, often they go hand in hand. And if you say that, obviously people will think you're just ignoring medical advice or whatever else. Um, but I don't. How do you feel about that? Do you think it's because it's a hot button issue, but it would make sense if that spiritual component again is real?
Yeah, it could be just enough to tip you over the edge, right? Again, if you're already predisposed to, we will say somebody, right, that's aggressive by nature, or they're easily triggered. If they go searching and dabbling in these things, and they come into contact with something, it's either gonna sort of disrupt their psychic makeup already, and
Mm,
might just push them over the edge to act upon something that they've already entertained, right, in their head. Maybe they've played out these scenarios as fantasies or whatnot, and then they go interacting with these things, and that just gives them that extra little nudge that they needed to actually manifest these things physically. uh,
mm,
I think by the same token, especially if you're talking to people with a religious background like a priest or somebody like that, they're going to see things with that through that filter as well, right? And again, it's sort of like, well, we have a respect. Obviously the Catholic Church acknowledges that these things exist, or otherwise there wouldn't be any exorcists, right?
mm-hmm,
So again, if you think about it, we've always mainstream religion has always acknowledged that these things are there. It's just that they don't necessarily want to shine a spotlight on it, right? Because it's something that you don't want to really bring out into the mainstream. It's sort of
mm-hmm,
like it's there, but just leave it where it is. Why
mm-hmm,
invite it to come out? out of the shadows, literally. But I think the more and more we know and we get to learn about these documented incidents, society is more or less again coming back into accepting that this exists, that it's real. It's not a fallacy. If somebody tells them an account that they experienced, they're not necessarily seen as a crazy person anymore. They're like, oh wow, that's deep. Hey, thanks for
Hmm.
sharing. It's no longer like, oh, you're crazy, man. Go, you belong in the loony bin. So it goes in cycles, right? It goes where in ancient times this was commonplace. We talk about at the campfire, right? People talking about their experiences that day. And now with last century or so, it sort of became taboo to talk about these things. And now it's coming back to the forefront where you share these experiences. It's like you and I are having this good conversation about it right now. And I don't think people who just hop in and listen think we're kooky. They're like, oh, there's something there, or they might identify. Well, you know what? I did experience something similar,
Hmm.
and it just gives people that avenue and the liberty to speak freely about these topics.
There's a lot of a lot of people with strange experiences, and a lot of people don't want to say anything because like they don't want to be like, to your point, said, oh, this person's crazy or whatever else. But so many people, especially around deaths and stuff, and people might say, or critics might say that, oh, you're just stressed or suffering from depression, and so you have all these moments. But then that itself sometimes is linked. And what's interesting about like we have a friend who was on the podcast. I don't know if you saw this one or not, but he's was in the military, and he was at a place called Baumholder, which is a barracks in Germany for the army. And it's notorious. A lot of those places are notorious for being haunted because of the long history of obviously Nazi Germany, prisoner of war camps, and all the some torture stuff, and like, and then on top of that, before then, there's probably castles and battles and things that predate all those kind of atrocities.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
but he was in a room and he would hear a coin scraping on the wall. It would go all the way down the wall, and it started over there. He never had any paranormal experiences before that, and it kept going and going and going. Nothing ever really increased from that. But then he came home, and then he started having weird things happen at home. He started getting some cigar smoke blown in his face, like really heavy cigar smoke. He checked everywhere. And now he's a law enforcement officer. He's been through, probably a couple of psychological tests. So it's like, these, you can't just dismiss, go, oh, the person's crazy or imagining it. And then he also heard footsteps. Other people heard these same footsteps and people moving in the hallways and stuff. So one of the the things that parapsychologists and investigators look at is they see if other people have also witnessed it, because then you can't just say someone's delusional or losing their mind. But he started getting cigar smoke in the face. Anyway, it culminated to him waking up with scratches on his body. And he was just like, at that point, he went and got help, kind of got some people, got some holy water and stuff. And he's such an easygoing guy. Um, but I think a lot of people have those, maybe not as intense as that one, because he thinks something latched onto him from over there and came over. But there's people differentiate between like hauntings, like when people talk about something traumatic that happened and there's like a recording going, and like there's a plane of maybe like an apparition or something that like you can't really
Mhm.
interact with. Then there's things you can interact with. Um, but I just think, yeah, like to your point, there's a stigma. I don't think people want to talk about it. I think if we weren't doing a podcast, I don't know if I would ever call into a podcast or like give messages and be like, hey, this is what happened to me. Let's blast it to everybody. Um,
Right.
but I think it's becoming more acceptable, though. I think people are becoming more spiritual, maybe less religious in a structured sense and more spiritual. Is that kind of what you've seen?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it just goes to the fact that now information's, at our fingertips, right? And if
Mhm.
we're ever curious about something, we don't have to wait to have that conversation with our pastor or a priest or a family member. We can we can be out and about, going about our daily routine and just quickly Google something or YouTube a video and listen to it as you're jogging or doing whatever, right? And
Mhm.
you're getting direct exposure to other people who are talking about these subjects that are of interest to you, and also you're able to maintain a certain anonymity, right, by just listening to third party accounts, right, and not
Mm.
necessarily being the one talking about it. But sooner or later, that person who's curious is going to get the courage to speak of their own experience, right, and share it with somebody. And I think that's what we're starting to see again, people coming back and no longer seeing it as a taboo, seeing the opportunity to share their experience without fear of being judged or looked at a certain way, just talking about what they've you know what they have seen firsthand.
Have any
So
family
I think
members
it's
ever
healthy to
come to
do
you?
that.
Have any
Oh
family
yeah,
members ever
my
talked to?
absolutely. My grandmother who passed away, she grew up in Guatemala, and and during a different time and era, right, in a
Mhm.
small town, not in a big city. And again, it goes to, I've always known this, that people that grew up in smaller towns without access to the things that we're familiar with, they didn't have all these distractions. So they were out in the open in the field all day long. They would go off into the forest and they would hear and see things, but like they were not necessarily afraid of these things because they'd heard these stories growing up, and oh yeah, this must be so and such and such. And they have specific names for entities that exist. And I think even in Mexico and a lot of Latin America, you're going to hear the same stories over and over again with different names assigned to these beings depending on what region you're in. But they're not necessarily afraid of them. They'll respect them. And there's certain areas that say you should not go in there after a certain time. You should just leave that area alone if you don't want to get scared. But they're also not in fear. Well, this is going to follow me home. It's sort of just they learn to interact with these spirits or these entities, if you will. And I think
Yeah.
that's what's missing in today's, at least for us living here in the United States, big cities, everything's digital. I think all this drowns out those frequencies, right? And that's why
Yeah.
earlier in our program we were talking about, if you ever have a chance, just go out camping for the weekend. Get away from the big city and just turn off your devices and just experience nature for what it is. And I think if you're going to have an opportunity to interact with something, it's going to be during these times where your mind is open and you're not, you know, weighed down by, our day to day
Hmm.
lives and responsibilities. I think it's good to have a digital detox every now and then.
Well, I guess one of the arguments is that we do have, or most people have, the ability to do some of these like clairvoyance or these different, I guess, talents, for lack of a better term. But we've lost them over time and getting away from that and getting on now on technology, and that's just going to get worse with AI. I don't know how you kind of reverse that train, but kind of a discussion for another day. But but I'm curious what you think about. I had a guy on, Nathaniel Gillis, a demonologist, and he was discussing um, entities appearing to people through time, and he felt it was all malevolent. And it depending on the time era, it would appear as certain things to us. So sometimes, and if you guys haven't seen this, I urge you to go on the podcast and check it out. Nathaniel Gillis, it's a recent episode, but he was saying that in the past it was demons like horns and hooves, and they would appear a certain way. And you can go through time and see different things. And then now it's aliens and UFOs. And that kind of goes back to the Jinn, which what we were talking about is they can shapeshift and change their appearance to us. And if it's taking advantage of our what we want, so now it's technology, and I think you touched on that earlier. And so is it coming to us through this? And he talked about mediums who would try to contact these things, and you can go through, it would try to appear as a deceased relative, a guide, an alien, a demon, and it would go through all these things, and eventually they got to this, and he felt it was like a program, like this thing was trying to control us. And then other entities, he got into like some occult stuff that they could go in there and use for like trying to get to human beings. But I don't know, how do you feel about that in terms of overall when we're talking about this? Do you feel like this stuff is malevolent, or do you feel like there's some good in there? And how do you, I don't know, what are you basing that on?
So part of me wants to remain open-minded and say, hey, this is neither good nor evil, or I guess some of it could be bad, and just like some of it could be good. But it's hard for me at this point in my life to just completely take off my religious filter, right? Having grown up in a church, and you know, they sort of associate a malevolent nature to these things, right? But again, if you think about and if you actually read the scripture, even the heroes of the Bible interacted with these sorts of beings, and it
Hmm.
wasn't necessarily a bad thing. And going back to the very beginning of the conversation, we're talking about beings of light. The Arabics and people of the Sumerian culture, Jinn were just one of three creatures, like you mentioned. There were the angels, beings of light, the jinns being these smokeless fire creatures, and us
Hmm.
humans being made out of clay. But three of us coexisted on the same plane, at some point. And if you think about the Christian, analog for evil, the devil, well, who was he? He was originally an angel, Lucifer, and he was the most splendid of all beings. Like he was the pride of God's creation. But at some point, like his head got too big and he rebelled and he wanted to be like the ultimate, right? And that's when he was cast down from heaven. Not only him, but a host of other, beings came down with him. And that's what we as Christians or people in Western culture would typically refer to as demons, right? But you know, we weren't there to see this. Obviously, we're taking this on faith, right?
Yeah.
We're taking this on faith. We're taking a leap of faith to say, yeah, this is. I'm going to believe this one account, right? But as you know, there's always two sides to a story, right? Who's telling the other side of the story?
Hmm.
Like, okay, if that is true 100%, then I also want to hear 100% the other version of it, right?
Hmm.
So that I can make my own opinion and come to my own conclusions. It's difficult to do that these days, I think. Oh, no, it should be easier to do that these days. But if you grow up in like any sort of predisposed uh, religion that's been just hammered into your head, it's hard to disassociate from that and say, okay, I'm going to take a more neutral view on this.
Hmm.
Because I think there's always that little bit of bias towards, oh, these things are malevolent, these things are bad.
Hmm.
But again, if you do your research, you'll see that that wasn't necessarily the case when these things were first written about. So
How
if
do
I
you?
can go back in time.
Yeah, I was gonna say, touching on the Bible and other religious texts, and like you don't want to like. I mean, you can be controversial about it, or you can get in debates about it. And I've heard religious scholars and people who just study these things and how they were found. The only issue I have, and we talk about faith and belief in God, and the story that's put forth by the Christian faith. It's hard for me to accept that sometimes because life is really hard. You deal with a lot of suffering, and if Jesus is the only way to heaven, then you're talking about how we had to dig up these things out of the ground. We had to get them translated. Like there's a lot of moving parts to get them to us today. And then we're asked to believe something that, like you said, is a story from a long time ago,
Mhm.
even when there's different, I guess, quotes from the New Testament about Jesus' own followers not believing when he was resurrected, still not believing their eyes, even though they were there and saw him. And this has
Right.
been echoed in recent podcasts. I think it's Wes Huff. He's really great. He's like he's just so intelligent about where these things came from. But that to me, that's hard because you're asking me to believe this story even in the face of a lot of different stuff. And it's not like we're getting hit with like, I mean, life is a miracle in a way when you talk about like having kids and like doing all these great
Hmm.
things. I mean, it's really can be really satisfying and wonderful, but there is a lot of pain. There's a flip side to that coin. So that's what pursues me to go look for this stuff. It's not because I don't believe in Catholic values or whatever else. I still am practicing Catholic, but it's very difficult sometimes to weigh that and think like, okay, what is the truth? And just because I'm told this, should I not go and pursue it and look for look at both sides of the argument, like you're saying? How do you feel
Hmm.
about the Bible? How do you feel about, I guess, where it's come from, kind of what we're given, what we should believe? Um, I guess I'll leave it there because I mean it's a very complicated question, and I guess I envy people who can just look at it and go, "I have faith," and they just believe 100%, at least on the outward face they put to this stuff. But I have to be honest with myself, and I can't. It's really hard, and I kind of go up and down with that daily. And that's like I said, a lot of fuel for the podcast is kind of exploring that. But how do you feel about all that? Because I know you were raised Christian.
Um, it's again, a part of me wants to just be neutral about it, right? And
Mhm.
again, like I said, if one account, we can't just take one account at 100% face value. Like you said, there's been a lot of, just think about the Bible as we know it today. I mean, you and I are English speaking. I also speak Spanish, but for the Bible to be translated to so many different languages, you're going to lose a lot, in translation, right? And then a lot over time has been manipulated and changed, I think, to fit a certain narrative, right? To fit one narrative, because there's other contemporary books in the Bible. Like, for example, I'm sure we've all heard of the Book of Enoch, right? It didn't make it to the final cut, if you will, of the Bible, but it's a text that exists and it's contemporary with those same scriptures. Why was it left out? Because this book takes a deeper dive into these other more obscure topics. It specifically names angels, and it talks about these beings that came from heaven that were cast down that interacted with mankind. Um, Being, of Latin American descent, of Mayan descent, my ancestors, they spoke about these things openly. They have their own sacred texts. They have something called the Popol Vuh, and it talks about this being that came to this continent and pretty much shared agriculture, astronomy with people, mathematics, and taught them how to harvest the land and how to build these elaborate structures and how to study the heavens for signs. And this story also, there's parallels to it in other cultures. This isn't part of the Bible, of course. If you think about historically what happened to my people, the Spanish conquistadors came here and they didn't say, "Hey, would you like to accept Jesus? And would you like to kneel before the cross?" They said, "Either you renounce your beliefs or you die." Right? You will kneel to the cross, otherwise we'll slaughter you and your family in front of you, and then we'll kill you. So a lot part of me struggles with that, with that, because this is all fact.
Mhm.
My people, my ancestors, they had their own belief systems. that were wiped out, by the conquering parties, and now we believe in other things, right? And so I think I would be doing myself a disservice if I didn't do my own research. If I just sat in church on Sundays and just said yes and yes and yes to everything, amen to everything that's preached from the pulpit, without doing my own research on the side and trying to
Mhm.
reconcile these belief systems with other things that exist. So go ahead.
Where are you at now in terms of that research? Because I could tell you where I'm at after, but I want to hear what you kind of where are you landing right now? And I know it's a journey, and I don't think
Yeah.
that's bad to say that. You could be labeled as a seeker or you're on a journey because I think most people are, and hopefully arriving to the right place. But where are you at right now?
Yeah, I like that term seeker because I think it's pretty arrogant for somebody to say, "Hey, I know the truth now," or "I finally come to real, to and be fully enlightened." I think we're always going to be seeking. That's part of the reason why we're here on this planet, right? Is to be on our own journey, and explore and draw our own conclusions. Uh, I think I am seeking. I've gone back to. I have a bunch of books that I purchased years ago that have just stood there, absorbing dust. There's an author that I really, and he's sort of become part of mainstream culture now. Graham Hancock. He's
Mm,
been on the podcast of Joe Rogan, but he wrote a lot of books in the early '90s. About ancient civilizations, and he talks a lot about how the Bible is pretty much a recollection of previous accounts. And sort of updated to more or less current times. So again, a lot of these religious entities that we read about in the Bible, they existed previously. Like the image that we have of Jesus. Well, why do we have the little Jesus fish, right? It goes back to an even more ancient god named Dagon. And if you look at like the Pope, right? The Pope, that headdress that he wears, it's in the shape of a fish. And if you look at a sculpture of this god Dagon from ancient Mesopotamia, it's the exact same headdress.
mhm,
So a lot of these things have been adapted from previous versions of these things that were in themselves recollections of even more ancient scriptures from older cultures. So I think right now where I'm at is I'm seeking, I'm on this journey to sort of do my own research and get in touch with my own ancestors and their belief systems and try to see why it is that we've lost touch with that. Why
mhm,
did we so openly embrace the Bible and Christianity? I know why. We didn't have a lot of them didn't have a choice, but now that we do have a choice and we can go back and you know get back in touch with these writings. Why don't we? Why are we scared to do that? I think religion has sort of like imparted a fear upon us. Like, don't go questioning that. Don't, no, 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 no. Don't go there. Just accept what we're telling you from here and you'll be fine. Um,
mhm.
there must be a reason why they're telling us don't go seeking.
Well, from the Christian perspective, I'll play devil's advocate here. Is that well, one being that there's historical evidence for Jesus. And this is why I've kind of ping pong back in my fourth in my head. Like if I talk to someone who had like just relentless faith, like what would they say back to me when I ask these questions? It's like there's historical evidence for Jesus existing as a person with from outside sources. There are numerous accounts of his disciples closely after his death, going to their own deaths, proclaiming that he was, God. And the people like to say, well, who dies for a lie, especially in the way that they were being killed. Um, and then a two part for that would be is that sometimes these older traditions and religious customs were, I guess, would be the devil, right? According to Christian belief, and you're worshiping possibly. And I think
Hmm.
there's a segment of the UFO community today who would echo this too, is they believe they're angels and demons, and that by entertaining these entities or past gods, is that really what you're interacting with is demons. Like how do you? Because I know we have this, and I don't want to call it baggage in a negative term, but the Catholicism and the Christianity background that we both have, and then your exploration now of what did I miss out, past culture, my heritage. How do you, I guess, walk that line that we kind of talked about earlier, making sure you have kind of one foot and you're not like stepping too
Hmm.
far. And it's like, whoa, man, now I'm doing occult practices and I'm doing seances in my garage. Like, how are you navigating that with your beliefs?
Let's go back to the word demon, right? It comes from the Greek word daemon, and
Mm,
these daemons, they were very much like the jinn. They were neither good nor bad. They just happened to be another type of being that existed, maybe on a different plane than us, but humans interacted with them at some point, and they helped a lot of human beings to develop and gain new knowledge, right? And that's what my culture talks about. It talks about these ancient beings, interacting with them and teaching them how to work the land, how to build, how to read, how to conduct mathematical equations. This knowledge came from somewhere. If you think about like the conventional narrative of how mankind evolved, it's really hard to accept that at some point we were, knuckle draggers, right? And suddenly we, smashed a couple of rocks and created a spark, and there's fire, and then suddenly we learned how to write and how to communicate, and then we started building cities. How did that happen? How come other animals haven't evolved that way, right? If we were dragging our knuckles alongside other species, how come other species that have been here even longer than us haven't evolved to that degree of
Hmm.
civilization, right, or sophistication?
Hmm.
So I think something had to have interacted with us. There's also that whole we haven't touched about it on this show, but maybe later on we will in some other future episode about genetic modification. What if we were what if we were knuckle draggers, primates, and some other visitors came and just tweaked a couple genetic sequences here and there, and we became this more intelligent primate that was now able to do their bidding, and we're their labor force without knowing it, right? What if we're
Hmm.
just harvesting the earth to a certain point to where they can come back and reap all the resources and say, hey, thank you monkeys for doing our hard work for us. you know I mean, there's so many ways that we can look at this. Ultimately, I think it's hard to disassociate from the Western accepted, what we come to accept as historical fact. It's only one narrative out of many, right?
Hmm.
And it's really humbling to say, hey, maybe we're wrong. Maybe we've got this wrong the whole way. Again, with religion, right? The generally accepted religion tells us certain things. This is the way, don't go there. This is what's right. That's wrong. This is good. That's bad.
Hmm.
Is it really that black and white, or is there this big gray area that we're purposely avoiding because we don't want to be, punished, or or we don't want to suffer the consequences of eternal damnation because we went there, right?
Hmm.
Uh, but I think that that's my struggle. Is just part of me really wants to go in there, dive head first, and there's that little bit of my upbringing that keeps me sort of like tethered, to believe in something that, like you said, it's written thousands of years ago, and it could be true. A lot of it could be true, and doesn't have to make other things untrue. A lot of these different narratives can be true at the same time.
Hmm.
But I do want to continue researching this, and I think maybe one day in the future, in the not so distant future, I won't have that religious stigma hampering me from really digging with all my resources into this.
Yeah. Yeah. I do look, I think I do on a practical level for evidence today. I do like to look at psychedelic people who have done like DMT, ayahuasca, and kind of the more not like some recreational thing where you're like blasting it every weekend, but people who go and do kind of like a whole um holy kind of almost religious ceremonial type preparation for it, and then near death experiences. And those people who have those experiences, and even more leaning toward near death, it's like sometimes you will get the baggage of your culture, what you believe, and you might see a light and you attribute it to Jesus, or you might see something else and you attribute it to another god or goddess or whatever it is. But there are ones that don't have any of that, and people will go in. I think Eben Alexander was one, and he was a neurosurgeon who had meningitis. They thought he was going to die, and it was it's a book. I had him on years ago, and he ended up interacting with what he perceived as God. And I think he said he was staying on the edge of like a black void. It's completely different than what you would think in terms of imagery.
Hmm.
And he came back with the idea, he said, of reincarnation, as and he never believed before. He was grew up, very, I forget what branch of Christianity, but none of those ideas were at play before for him. And he comes back with those ideas. So for me, and to what you were talking about, it's like, you're being delivered this message, and I don't think it's a bad message. A lot of the teachings of Jesus and everything else, obviously I think that's a very beneficial framework, especially for children, even if you don't believe it. Um, but there seems to be a history of humanity and religious experience that tends to be ignored in terms of like ancient cultures and maybe what they were doing, what they were experiencing. And then you couple on the DMT experiences and the near death experiences, and it's like I can't just ignore those because a lot of those people who are doing that research are coming to the conclusion that consciousness is the base layer of reality. And this is kind of where I'm at right now. And from that, uh, this material world comes. And then the brain's kind of like a receiver. We get that feed. When we die, the feed goes back. And that's shown by near-death experiences where brain activity goes down, psychedelics where brain activity goes down, and consciousness expands, and we have more real than real. And that's kind of the conundrum that scientists are currently facing, is like, how is this happening? So I believe that that's at play, or at least from what I've heard so far. And from those people who are doing those studies, you don't get a whole lot of like dogma, you know? You don't get a whole lot of
Yeah.
like, you got to follow these steps. And that's where I'm kind of like, I feel like I'm sitting right in the middle of that, you know?
Yeah, they're not hindered by those preconceived notions. They're just saying
Mhm.
things as they lay before them, right?
Yeah.
And 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 I just wanted to add in conclusion before we run out more of the time here,
Mhm.
is that if we, again, both having religious backgrounds, if you think about it, Jesus Christ, right? We believe in the story of Immaculate Conception, and he ascended, after death back up to the heavens. So he himself was not a human being. Like he was not a conventional, you know, being made out of clay. And he inhabited a human body, but he's
Mhm.
something else, right? We say he's God, right? The Trinity. Uh, he's definitely not a human being. So that's why at the beginning of this, I was saying, how is it that we so easily accept religion at face value, not just say it's faith based? No, this is actually the truth. This is the way it was. But we have bias towards other accounts, towards other possibilities, uh, so I think we sometimes we have to remove those goggles, and just be more open minded and expand our peripheral vision to really take into account all these other historical records of these things, and give them the same amount of time and opportunity that we give to our religion that we have accepted.
Mhm.
The truth is there somewhere in the middle, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's evident by, we started talking about Jinn, and we're noting all the similarities between, it's just terminology at this point. Like even when you get
Exactly.
into the whole consciousness idealism thing, you can find a lot of symbolism in the Bible, and it's kind of like if you open your eyes to that and you're not taking things necessarily literally, you go like, "Oh
Hmm.
man, like this is pretty crazy," because
Yeah.
you have things that kind of like branch across the spectrum. And if you're too kind of embedded in one, obviously you're not might not view it that way. But if you're on the outside kind of looking in for the, the quote unquote truth, whatever that is, um, it's fascinating to see how a lot of religions are pointing to the same like destination. It just kind of depends on how you're
Exactly.
getting there.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, I feel like we've run this about an hour. I guess we can call it. And then I'd love to do this with you again. Like it's fun to kind of pick out a topic and then kind of go down the rabbit hole. And then we ended up a little bit further away from the gin than we started with.
Right.
but I feel like actually we didn't get into too much of the UFO stuff, and we probably should maybe talk about that a lot next time. Because
Yeah,
I
definitely.
finally saw the video that you talked about, because they started recycling it again, where the Tomahawk missile hits the
Right.
UFO, and then like it
Just glances off. It just continues
yeah,
its course.
because I was like, first I was like, did it just break? And then pieces went, and then it kind of like dived in down to the ocean and crashed. But then they showed a wide view, and I guess it kept going. So I was just
Yeah.
like, okay, maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm telling you, there's these things that are coming to light, and I think at the end of the day, they're controlling the release of this information, right? Because it would just completely topple everything that we've accepted as conventional, wisdom, or religion will go out the window, academia will go out the window. We have to like start with a blank page all over again, rewrite history and even faith, So yeah,
Mhm.
there's a lot of good stuff to talk about, man. One
Yeah,
hour is not enough to cover
no,
all these topics.
no. But yeah, thank you for coming on. I really do appreciate that. It was fun to bounce it off. Last time I did a solo, and it's always fun to have somebody else on because you start interacting, you start building more questions and go down more rabbit holes. Um, for everybody listening, check us out on YouTube. If you're watching on TikTok, check us out on YouTube. We have podcasts weekly. I don't know if you want to mention your own channel for those listening, Pablo, if you want to anything coming out or anything that you like to post or keep tabs on.
Yeah, I see a couple of people here that follow me in the chat. Thank you, Anime Animacion. I appreciate that. Nando's Bunchies, thank you for joining. Damien, thank you. You know where to follow me. I'm going to be doing more of these topics in the future as well. Aside from our collectibles, I'm going to be touching more on the paranormal. Right? These discussions are always interesting. They're always fun, and I think they're good. Thank you, Scott, for the opportunity to share your this podcast with you. It was great.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you, bud.
All
All
right.
right.
See you next time. All right.